Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is my colleague from the West, as I refer to him, David Powell. Dave, how you doing today, pal?
Good, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. So you have a brand new book out, and I'm hoping we can talk about it.
I do. It's called Decisions at Shiloh, the 22 Critical Decisions. I'll flash it up here. And it's a part of a series, actually. There are now a bunch of these volumes out. And they're not narrative histories of the battle. I tell people, certainly the series tells people, you have to approach them the way you would a tour or a staff ride. They're really meant to be something akin to a staff ride and provoke thinking in your head about not just what happened, but why it happened. And it's done so usually through a pattern of decision trees. If General or Colonel so-and-so did something, made a decision, made a choice, then obviously that the outcome changed, the ultimate impact on the battle. And that's the criteria we use. Obviously, there are thousands of decisions, millions of decisions made in every battle. Every individual soldier makes a decision whether to shoot or run. But not all those decisions are, I guess, germane to the outcome of the battle in the same way that obviously the Army commander decides to break off pursuit. That's a big decision. And so it's kind of within that framework that the series works. And I've done two of these now. The first one was Decisions at Chickamauga, which is kind of a natural for me, given how much else I've written on Chickamauga. And the second one here, Shiloh, I kind of fell into.
Now, I'll talk about the Shiloh one in a second, but since you brought up the Chickamauga one, I mean, I remember when you and I spoke about that book when it first came out, and my first question for you was, what else did you have to say about Chickamauga after your definitive 3-volume history? And you said, well, the format actually gave you a way to say some things and come to some insights that you hadn't been able to touch on.
Absolutely. I don't care how much you write, how many words on a topic you bring forth. It's almost impossible to use every source to cover every aspect. And the decisions format at Chickamauga, it allowed me to focus on some of the philosophical underpinnings of military strategy, certainly in the 19th century, certainly the way the Union and Confederate generals thought about things, by and large, in a Napoleonic tradition, even if they're not necessarily seeking that one decisive battle. And you can argue by 1863, nobody has found that one decisive battle. They're still thinking in terms of concentration of force, local superiority, the massing of artillery, things like that. And so you kind of take a step back from, the 96th Illinois move by the left flank and all of the details, the tactical details. And you try and interpret, or at least I do, try and interpret why the general or the colonel or whoever is the focus of your decision, why he reached that decision. And so you get to, like I said, speak a little bit about the philosophical background, whether he's a trained West Pointer or a complete novice who's literally learning it by reading manuals the night before.
Now, I'll admit I wrote a book in this series as well, based on the good experience you had writing your book. I was like, Dave, this is a good, and you said you had a good experience. So I agreed to write on Fredericksburg for it. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was when you talk about those decision points, here are the options that were available at that moment, which is something I think a lot of people forget about, that in the moment, nothing was preordained, and there was this
Right.
array of possibilities in those moments. And so to capture those moments and those options, I think really becomes a vibrant way of looking at history, bringing it kind of back to life in a way that still makes it living and in actual and open ended.
I agree. The idea is that, we study history, we write about history as a narrative flow. This happened, then this happened. And in our field, alternate history, alternate reality is discouraged, and rightly so. It's easy to wander off track. Even in this series, it's easy to speculate on, well, if he'd only gone to the left instead of the right, things would be different. I think the best books in the series are the ones that narrow that focus and present you with the options in a way that suddenly makes it very different. It's not preordained that Robert E. Lee is going to throw 13,500 men against the center of the Union line on July 3rd. Suddenly there are choices. Should he go here? Should he go there? And then you have to suggest, but not, you have to suggest what might have happened without writing a Harry Turtledove novel. I guess is the best way to put it. Not that Harry Turtledove's novels are bad, but they're not history.
Right. So how is it that you ended up writing about Shiloh as a guy who's known as the Chickamauga guy, and now working on the Atlanta campaign, and two great Chattanooga books in there, by the way, I'll also mention.
Thank you.
How Shiloh, where did that come from?
Well, the Matt Spruill and Larry Peterson both liked my Chickamauga book, and they've been lining up other authors like yourself, like a lot of the folks we know, that to do a series of books on as many of the Civil War battles as they think they can cover. They lined up a guy for Shiloh, and then he had to withdraw. And my first thought was, well, I'd like to write on Shiloh. Some years ago, I started to collect some research material on Shiloh. And then Tim Smith and his writing partner Gary, pardon me, I forget his name, but they produced Cunningham's book on the Shiloh campaign of 1862, which is an excellent piece of work. And then it wasn't, just a few years ago that Tim Smith produced his own book on Shiloh. And I thought, there's probably not a lot of room for me to write a book on Shiloh. And also I'm good friends with Tim. So I asked him, did you want to do decisions at Shiloh? He says, no, my plate is full. So I said, well, good, I'll go ahead and take it. It was a way to approach the battle, which over time I've come to appreciate more and more. I was very much in the von Moltke mind meld. If you go back 20 years ago, two armed mobs running around the woods. Shiloh is in that first, what I call the formative stage of the war, before the armies are really trained up. And most of the regiments that fight at Shiloh, it's their first experience in battle. And for many of them, it's their first experience being issued live ammunition ever. And here, go fight. Yeah. So it's a somewhat different battle than, say, Chickamauga, or certainly the Atlanta campaign, where largely veteran units are fighting in a much different style. But I still wanted to write about Shiloh, and this was a vehicle, a way to do it in a new way. And again, I fell back on that sort of staff-led philosophy.
So you came up with 22 critical decisions. And again, the series defines a critical decision as a decision that alters the course of events in a significant way. It's like a real pivot point. How did you go about the process of narrowing your choices down?
I start by listing all of the decisions that I think had an impact. And then I look at that list. Usually, well, with Chickamauga and with Shiloh both, it was a little too long. And so then I went back and really thought about it. It's kind of a thought experiment. You sort of lay out what the alternate outcomes in your mind and go, well, was that really likely, or would that really have changed much? And I still come down on the side. I know some books are shorter, some books are longer, but I think that somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 25 decisions are probably going to be the significant ones. It's a mix of what the senior commanders are doing, very important, but also critical decisions that subordinates make. Sometimes on their own initiative, sometimes the decision to obey an order, or just as importantly, the decision to ignore an order. It's not set in concrete. These are certainly opinions, not necessarily facts or concrete facts. But then comes the interesting challenge for any writer, I think, of supporting your theses. Does it work? Can you make a good argument? And in Shiloh, there are two decisions I ended up throwing out because they didn't rise to the level, and one decision which I thought I wasn't going to put in, but I ended up putting in because I finally came to the decision that it was germane and too important.
So it sounds like it's really a way for you to be learning more about the battle as you're writing about it.
Yes. Yeah. It's certainly a way to look at any battle in a new perspective.
And it must have been kind of cool to be able to flex your muscles on the large strategic level and then kind of on the lower tactical level of some of those decisions getting made in the heat of the moment in the spot on the battlefield. And those are kind of two different decision-making processes, aren't they?
Yes. The very first decision in this book, there's one of the aspects of the book is the last chapter, which is essentially a tour guide. The first decision in this book, which is set in Shiloh, Tennessee, just 20 miles north of Corinth, is made in St. Louis, Missouri. Obviously, a little far to go in a tour guide, but yeah, in terms of operational and strategic decision making, the theater becomes important. And one of the very first things that any theater commander has to decide is, what's his objective? Where's he going? What's he doing? And certainly in 1862, in the spring of 1862, after the fall of Donelson and Henry and the apparent collapse of the entire Western Confederate defense, there are a lot of choices on the table. And there are a lot of generals fighting for resources to exploit those choices. And one man, Henry Halleck, has to make the choice. And so that's kind of where I start. And yeah, it's great fun.
How does Halleck measure up for you?
Halleck is he's actually a better general as a theater commander. He's a very cautious man. He's got a lot of what I call old Army West Point disease, which is he doesn't trust the men under his command very much. He has a little bit of tunnel vision about the scope of this war compared to earlier wars America's fought in, or certainly that he's been involved in. But by and large, he makes good strategic decisions in 1862. I think he falls apart completely in 1863 and 4 when he's removed from immediate command, and now he has to direct subordinates in all theaters. And, as Gideon Wells once said, he decides nothing.
Yeah.
He just, what the phrase is, rubs his elbows and smokes. uh, I and there he seems to defer constantly to the men in the field. Well, they know better. They know better. But you're not setting them objectives, or if you are setting them objectives, you're not ensuring that they're moving to fulfill those objectives. So I think that's an interesting aspect of his personality that I'm not sure even his biographers have really brought out.
Uh-huh.
You know, the pat answer is always Peter Principle, but
Right.
but I think it goes a little beyond that. I think that at the theater level of command, he was able to manage and focus, and also someone was giving him orders. Someone was telling him, setting objectives for him. But once he got to Washington, he was the guy who was supposed to do that. And both Lincoln and Stanton became very frustrated with him ultimately. I think Grant played him just right.
Yeah. Okay.
You stay here in Washington, I'm going to go run the army. You handle the paper.
Playing to his strengths as a first-rate clerk, right?
Yeah.
So do you have any favorite characters in this account? You know, I know that you're, you know, as a historian, you're supposed to be looking sort of objectively, but you know, we all have folks that we become partial to over the time. Anybody in particular?
Colonel Everett Peabody, a civil engineer originally from Massachusetts. He's a brigade commander in Grant's brand new 6th Division under Prentiss. And when the whole army is saying, no, we're not going to get attacked, don't send anybody out to do any reconnaissance, Colonel Peabody says, nonsense. He's the guy who sends out the patrol early on the morning of April 6th against orders. And essentially tips the Confederates' hand, begins the fight probably an hour early, and gives the rest of the Federal, at least 1st Division's, time to form up. He's also killed by 9:30 in the morning, mortally wounded, and so for a number of years, no one really paid that much attention to him. He's certainly getting a lot more attention in the newer scholarship at Shiloh. And then this might sound a little odd, but I have a soft spot for John A. McClernand.
Okay.
He's a bombastic, annoying politician who Sherman dislikes and Grant dislikes, but he's also one of those civil soldiers, you know, civilian soldiers, I should say, who's actually turns out to be surprisingly effective as a field commander. And it's one of the unsung aspects of Shiloh is when McClernand and Sherman essentially, mostly at McClernand's urging, launch a counterattack out of Jones Field at noon on April 6th, at a time when the Federals have been getting beat up and they're retreating. Three different defensive lines have collapsed. McClernand counterattacks, and it turns out to be the right decision. It has a big impact on the battle. It draws a lot of Confederate force away from where they should be to go deal with the counterattack and this point of resistance. As I put in the book, it changes things a lot. There's some characters. There's Confederate General Gladden, who's got one of the best quotes of the entire American Civil War. All it takes to make a Zouave is an Irishman and 6 yards of red flannel. And there's Colonel David Stewart from Chicago, a sort of scandalous Chicago attorney who got involved in a divorce, but who raises a regiment and is later given brigade command and does surprisingly well on April 6th as well. There's our only Swedish American Civil War veteran that I know of, Oscar Malmborg, who was the lieutenant colonel of the 55th Illinois. The men hate him. He's an old Army, European Army martinet. He forms Square because he thinks he's about to be charged on the field at Shiloh. I always like little tales of squares.
Yeah.
You know, we track certain tactical aspects, and this is one of them. His after the war, he goes back to Sweden. His papers and uniform and everything are in a museum in Gothenburg, Sweden. I'd dearly love to go there and see that.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean, there are characters, and there are also like Peabody and McClernand, men whose decisions have a surprising impact.
And spoken like a true New Englander by calling him Peabody instead of Peabody, which most people tend to know him as. And you know, I think Prentice's post-war actions to kind of cover his own butt, you know, really led to Peabody's obscurity. And you mentioned he's getting a lot more attention in current literature. Why is that folks are finally now taking a closer look at him?
I think primarily because we have so much better access to sources. We have so many more primary sources with which to work. Everything from a treasure trove of newspaper accounts that are now at our fingertips that weren't there at the time, or much harder to dig out, say in the 60s, 70s, even the 1990s. You had to go to archives and spend time in front of microfilm. Now we can go digitally. Yeah. And also the ease of which I find it now. If I find an interesting source online at a repository, it's not that hard to call them up and tell them exactly what I want and have them, you know, ship me 20, 30, 40 pages at a nominal cost. So I think we're just we're experiencing a much deeper level of research, and also any you know, if you're going to write history, it has to be revisionist history, I think.
Right.
Not in the pejorative sense, but really, what's the point of writing a book of history if you're just going to repeat everything that the previous book said? We all strive to find new angles, new takes. That's revisionism, and Peabody is just benefiting from that, I think.
Yeah. So you've talked about folks on the Union side. Anybody on the Confederate side that you came to better appreciate?
That's interesting. I think Beauregard deserves a lot more credit than he's largely gotten. And the one area where he really fell down on the job, heretofore no one seems to have really criticized him that much. He broke off the attack on the night of April 6th, as he should have, as it was inevitable. But then he didn't do that much on the morning of April 7th to get the Army ready. He didn't expect that Grant would be so heavily reinforced or to face a counterattack. But once he faced that counterattack, though, he did a pretty amazing job of organizing a defense out of almost thin air, throwing troops into line, and counterattacking aggressively wherever possible. He fought a very active defense on April 7th, and probably saved the Army.
Yeah, that could have been an absolute rout and was not.
Right.
Based on the way he kind of pulled people together.
Right. There are Bushrod Johnson, who I know from Chickamauga fame has an interesting role, though he doesn't figure in the book much because he's only a brigade commander. Patrick Claiborne, same thing. He's present on the field, but he's largely reacting to decisions handed to him, not making his own. So there are some familiar faces, but by and large, I don't think I passed or I had a real significant change of opinion about any significant Confederate on the field, the way I maybe had with, especially with General McClernand.
So let me back up to Beauregard on the night of the first day's battle, and he calls off the attack. And you've just said that was the right decision. But it seems to me like that's one of those decisions that has sort of transcended all
Yeah.
we know about the Civil War. It's like one of the linchpins of lost cause mythology because of the lost opportunity. So like that's a particular decision that has taken on a life of its own. How do you handle something like that as an author, knowing that there's just so much packed into that particular moment as a result of the historiography?
One of the really fun things about writing Civil War history is the controversies. And we have so many of them, right? Every battle has its own, and some of them, you're right, become mythic. The two at Shiloh are enshrined on the UDC monument there at Shiloh: death and night. Death in the form of the death of Albert Sidney Johnson, and then night in Beauregard's decision to break off the attack. If but for that, but what I like to do is sort of go back to the earliest contemporary accounts, and because a lot of the controversy only starts after the fact, sometimes days, sometimes months, often years. And so generals who maybe thought it was a good idea at 5:45 on April 6th will be, by April 10th, when they're back in Corinth and they feel like this didn't go well, will be starting to say, maybe we shouldn't have retreated. And then, in 1870 or 75, they'll be like, we lost the war because of that buffoon. Yeah. And if you go back to the contemporary sources, and Beauregard, in what really is his autobiography, though it's written by two of his staff officers, the 2-volume history of Beauregard and the American Civil War, Beauregard really marshaled a number of primary source accounts in that he republished or arranged to have published in that book, that talk about, at the time, generals like Bragg and Hardee were pretty much in agreement, or not only in agreement, but or not agreeing per se, as presented with a fait accompli. The Confederate Army was almost as in bad a shape as the Federal Army on the night of April 6th. They also had 10 or 11,000 stragglers. They also had formations that began the day with 600 men and ended the day with 50. They were a disorganized mess. Some of their troops had already marched back all the way to their start lines to where they camped. Others marched and took over Federal camps. Beauregard had no clue where the army was. By then, the three principal Confederate commanders, Polk, Bragg, and Hardee, weren't commanding their formations anymore. They were simply commanding segments of line, and brigades and regiments were all mixed up. So there really isn't as much controversy on April 6th as there will be going forward. And that's really the interesting part of untangling that controversy, is pointing out what contemporary thought was as opposed to what came later.
I think that's also another great example of armchair generals who don't know the battlefield, able to make judgments. If you walk along the battlefield near Grant's last line, and particularly where the ground the Confederates would have had to cross to assault it, like, that's terrible terrain. So of course, I agree that Beauregard made the right choice, because that's a really hard stretch of ground to get across under those conditions. So it's easy to second guess that when you've never walked that ground.
Yeah. And the handful of Confederates that went down into like the Dill Branch Ravine, rather, talk about how terrible this is. And Grant had something on the order of 60 field pieces lined up, a couple of siege pieces. It was almost hub to hub artillery at the top of the ravine. I don't think a fresh division or infantry corps could have taken that line, much less exhausted, disorganized troops.
And what do you make of Albert Sidney Johnston's decision to lead from the front?
Johnson, Johnson was a gambler. There's no question that he was going all in this Texas Hold'em game. And that said, he felt he needed to inspire all these raw volunteers as much as possible with his personal leadership. He also felt that he could only redeem the failures of earlier in 1862 with a spectacular victory, again, with his personal leadership. He did leave Beauregard. This is an unusual example. We have a Confederate Army with two commanders. Both are full generals. Both are West Point professionals. Both have quite a bit for 1862, quite a bit of both pre-war and Civil War combat experience by then, commanding large formations. Very rare for most of the people running around in 1862. And Beauregard was basically to control the pace of the battle and funnel reinforcements and commit reserves. Beauregard was acting as, I think the best analogy probably would be Erwin Rommel in North Africa and his chief of staff. His chief of staff was the guy who was conducting the larger battle. Or another analogy might be Hindenburg and Ludendorff in the 1917, 1918. Hindenburg is the figurehead and inspiring soldier, and Ludendorff is the accounting wizard who's going to control the pace of the battle. And Johnson also didn't want to leave that. He didn't want to reverse roles and stay at headquarters and try and control the battle, because Beauregard was sick. And also Beauregard believed that there was no chance of surprise anymore. And as early or as late as the morning of the 7th said, we should go back to Corinth. And so Johnson felt that if anyone was going to motivate the army, it was going to be him. And so I think when I said he went all in, including himself. And, at 2:30 in the afternoon, that bet didn't pay off. But he was going to give it everything he had.
Is there a decision that is like the most important decision? And I ask that question knowing that a lot of these are dominoes, and one happens and it leads to the next, and it leads to the next, and there are a lot of interconnectivity between them. But is there one decision that you would say was like the key decision?
Yes, I have to go back to McClernand and the counterattack out of Jones Field. That bought Grant 3 hours, maybe 4. It allowed a pause that essentially created the sunken road, a Hornet's Nest position. It allowed that line to coalesce. It allowed Grant time to begin forming his final line at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And most importantly, it diverted 9 of the 13 available Confederate infantry brigades away from moving towards Pittsburgh Landing to move to oppose the counterattack or in response to the movements there. It also, there is one downside. Because of the way the event subsequently played out, it made it a little bit easier for the Confederates to surround that sunken road position, because Prentiss and W.H.L. Wallace decided not to retreat. But by and large, the impact for the Federals was mostly positive and dramatically so.
Now, Prentiss, of course, will spend a lot of time talking about how that was the most important decision of the war: save the battle, save the army, by staying there at the Hornet's Nest. How do you assess his assessment of that?
Well, first of all, obviously he's self-promoting. It's pretty clear he's self-promoting when you read all of this post-war stuff or even during the war, later in the war. And it's also unclear whether there was an actual decision, because Prentice insists that, Grant told us to stay here or die. So that's what we did. W.H.L. Wallace, of course, died. And so we don't know what W.H.L. Wallace decided. But what we do know is that he died in the act of retreating. So the division was, his division was already pulling out of the sunken road. And he's about 85 to 90% of the defenders for the entire sunken road position. Tim Smith will hate me for that. The sunken road is not sunken, never has been, but we call it that. We have no choice. And yeah, it didn't hurt Prentice's reputation that after the war, the Lieutenant Colonel Reed, the parks historian, was a member of one of the Iowa regiments that defended the Hornets' Nest and helped form the Hornets' Nest Brigade Reunion Association. And obviously, just from that name alone, you can tell where his focus was.
Yeah.
And he argued strongly, he in the infrastructure of the park, he built an argument that it was the key to the Union defense.
And I think too, Wallace's death, he's the one person who can corroborate or contest Prentice's version of the stories, and he's dead on the field. So there's a martyr involved, and that makes Prentice all the more noble for his defense. And,
right.
Yeah.
Not that I'm necessarily too hard on Prentice. I do think that is a decision I cover in the book, and I talk about options. I think they stayed too long. I don't think they needed to stay as long as Prentice insisted that they needed. But the defense of the Hornets' Nest did occupy considerable Confederate attention from about 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. So that in and of itself has some significant benefits to the defenders.
Now, another of the great controversies of Shiloh is, of course, the appearance of Don Carlos Buell. Do you have a decision in the book that is centered around him, or that he has made, that brings him into the story?
We talk about his, or I talk about his counterattack on the morning of April 7th, but he plays a subsidiary role here. Grant is clearly in charge. Grant has the line of authority, and so Buell doesn't do a lot of independent decision making. So I talk about his arrival. I talk about the decision to move troops across the river on the night of April 6th, the reinforcements that come to bolster Grant's line. But he's not, that's actually one of those decisions that I talked about, one of those guys, when I was building my initial list of decisions, he got cut early, I guess, in the editing process.
He's on the cutting room floor, huh?
Yeah, it's because he's not, he's General Buell, right? He's cautious by nature. For anyone who studied Perryville, you go, oh yeah, it's Buell. And so he didn't have a big impact on the battle. I think his troops did, but
he didn't. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I have come to admire about Grant over the years is just his resiliency, his ability to keep his cool. What is this book, or what is his decision making in this book do to help us understand Grant in his evolution as a commander?
One of the most remarkable decisions of the battle, and maybe of the whole war, is Grant's decision to stay overnight on the field at Shiloh. Sherman, Lew Wallace, McPherson, who is only a lieutenant colonel, an engineering officer on Grant's staff at this time. They're all like, okay, the Confederates have stopped attacking. Night has fallen. Do you want us to start arranging for the retreat? Grant says, no, we're not retreating. Lick them tomorrow. And that's something you don't very often see. You can go through the whole list of Civil War battles, and you don't see that kind of resolve in many commanders. And I can be pretty critical of Grant at Shiloh. There's a number of things that, I think he flat out blundered on. But that unwillingness to surrender the initiative, that unwillingness to admit defeat, is an important attribute. And certainly it wins the war ultimately in 64, 65, but you definitely see it on display at Shiloh. And that's, I spend a lot of time discussing that.
Yeah, it's really one of those moments of true grit in the war, it's become apocryphal or
I have sort of, my world is divided into pro-Grant camps and anti-Grant camps. And I had this was true with Chattanooga as well. I had, guys who were found out I was writing about Grant at Shiloh or Grant at Chattanooga, and they're like, oh, I hope you treat him right. I hope you tell the truth about him, i.e., to drag him through the mud, slap him around. And I tell each of them at the end of the day, Grant comes in for a fair share of criticism from me in both books. Yeah. But I'm not. But I'm simply not going to hold an anti-Grant pep rally anytime soon. Yeah. I think that. The other thing I like to tell audiences or groups or even just in casual conversation, give me any general, a Civil War, North or South, Union or Confederate, and I can find you their best day and their worst day pretty easily. Yeah. And it's pretty dramatic sometimes. The guy you think who should have been given command of the army in 1861. Well, what about this battle? Look at this blunder. Oh yeah. I mean, they're all learning. We have nothing. They had nothing like the modern professional development courses that the U.S. Army now trains. We don't have staff colleges and command and general staff schools and all of the professional development stuff. None of that existed. You graduated West Point, and as Ewell said, I took command of a troop of cavalry and forgot everything else.
Yeah. So as you settled on your list of decisions, was there one decision that surprised you the most?
The one I struggled with has to do with deployment. Okay. The Confederate deployment at Shiloh on April 6th is hugely controversial. But as the Confederates basically set up a front line a little over a mile long, and that was primarily Hardee's Corps. And then behind it, they had Bragg's Corps about a mile and a half long, in a 2-rank line, regiment after regiment. And then the Polk's Corps and the Reserve Corps, each really more like a strong division, in lines or in column behind those. So the biggest problem was that when Hardee attacked and his lines became fragmented, the troops behind him belonged to a different corps. And so he didn't have any immediate reserves. He was trying to command a front of more than a mile through woods and fields and ravines, and it proved impossible. So obviously all of that has become hugely controversial after the war, especially since Albert Sidney Johnson at least hinted that he was going to do things differently when he left Corinth. But I also point out that it's the same formation that Stonewall Jackson used at Chancellorsville, which we regard as one of the tactical, the most brilliant tactical victories of the war.
Great comparison, by the way. Great comparison.
And so to take a step back from that, why the reason I almost didn't include it as a decision is because in both cases, the armies were following doctrine. They were following Winfield Scott's 1838 manual that basically said when you deployed divisions and brigades, you deployed them in long lines on long fronts. And because they didn't have much combat experience, though arguably Jackson should have had plenty of combat experience by May of 1863, but they were simply falling back on what they'd been taught, which, as any soldier will tell you, is often the case. The stress of command makes it very difficult to innovate or step outside of the box. But in the end, I came back to that decision, and it did have such a huge impact. And Albert Sidney Johnston suggested a different deployment. And so it's the decision that I ended up rewriting twice and finally settled on the format that it's in. But to this day, I still believe that there's a lot of doctrinal underpinnings to all this, that how many generals would have done it differently, I'm not sure. It's kind of what Grant did on April 7th when he attacked. He just lined everybody up and they kept moving forward.
I want to let the record show that it was 40 minutes into this conversation, and I, the Stonewall Jackson fanboy, was not the one who brought him up. So.
Duly noted. We can read it back in the minutes.
There we go. Thank you. So, Dave, is there anything about your book that I haven't asked that I should have?
This is the question that always blanks my mind.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I don't know. I don't think so. I think we've covered, a lot of the points. I'm pretty happy with the way the book turned out. I think we'll see how it sells and how it's received. I'll look forward to early reviews. Hopefully they'll be good. You never know. But I think, it helps that it's part of a series. And by now, people who buy the book, by and large, will probably know what they're getting into. I wasn't so sure with Decisions at Chickamauga. It's like, he's written a lot on Chickamauga. It's not a history of the battle.
Well, I look forward to reading it. It's brand new, so I haven't even had the chance to get my hands on it yet. But I'm really looking forward to it. Your work is just spectacular. The book is called Decisions at Shiloh, 22 Critical Decisions that Defined the Battle, coming from University of Tennessee Press by David A. Powell. And let me sort of finish up with just a slightly different note. Dave, you recently announced on Facebook that you have started volume 2 of your Atlanta study. Yes. So I want to just offer your congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's really only a few lines in one chapter, in one Word file, but it marks the official start date.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure talk about that as the projects develop, but I'm excited for you. Can't wait to read what you come up with. It's been fun to follow your progress on the blog and on Facebook, and I know you've put together a dynamite study so far.
Thank you.
Dave, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, we will see you online and on the battlefield.